While working on what I hope will be a feature-length video on the mysteries of the Pacific fur trade, I came across a spooky story in the memoirs of John Rodgers Jewitt, an English blacksmith who was enslaved by Moachat Nootka Indians from 1803 to 1805 on the northwestern shores of Vancouver Island. The harrowing adventure which Jewitt chronicled in his two autobiographies, the second being an elaboration of the first, began in the spring of 1803, when the 20-year-old author left his father's home in Hull, England, on an American merchant ship called the Boston, hoping to make his fortune in the New World. The Boston's captain, John Salter, hoped to sail to the Pacific Ocean by way of Cape Horn, make his way up the west coast of the Americas to the west coast of Vancouver Island, and exchange goods like knives and hatchets for sea otter pelts procured by the local Nootka Indians, who had only been in contact with whites for a mere 29 years. After taking on wood and fresh water on the island, the Boston was to sail across the Pacific to China, where additional European goods would be traded for Ming porcelain, tea, and silk. The Boston reached Vancouver Island without incident, and moored in Friendly Cove at the mouth of Nootka Sound, 5 miles north of the Moachat Nootka village of Yuquot. The following day, the ship was visited by Chief McQuina, the powerful leader of the Moachat, who arrived in a canoe along with several of his retainers. McQuina was no stranger to white men, having hosted, traded, and made dealings with civilian merchants and royal envoys alike, including British explorer Captain George Vancouver and Viceroy of New Spain, Captain Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Quadra. At the time of the Boston's visit, he had a conversational knowledge of English, and could understand much of the sailors' banter he heard around him. McQuina appeared much pleased on seeing us, Jewitt wrote in his memoir, and with great seeming cordiality, welcomed Captain Salter and his officers to his country. For 8 days, the crew of the Boston made preparations for the upcoming voyage to China. Crew members under the direction of sailmaker John Thompson, a tough old Royal Navy veteran who had seen action in the French Revolutionary Wars, repaired the sails and refit the rigging. A small crew went ashore to find water and cut timber. Jewitt himself spent his time repairing muskets and making knives and tomahawks, often under the admiring gaze of Chief McQuina and his sub-chiefs, who took a great interest in his work. Meantime, more or less of the natives came on board of us daily, Jewitt wrote, bringing with them fresh salmon, with which they supplied us in great plenty, receiving in return some trifling articles. Captain Salter was always very particular before admitting these people on board to see that they had no arms about them, by obliging them indiscriminately to throw off their garments, so that he felt perfectly secure from any attack. On March 19th, while dining with Captain Salter, Chief McQuina remarked that there were many wild ducks at Yuquot. Salter took the occasion to present the chief with a double-barreled flintlock shotgun. 2 days later, McQuina returned to the ship and gave the gun back to the captain, explaining that one of the locks was broken, and stating that the gun was bad. Taking this as a display of contempt, Salter angrily insulted McQuina and asked Jewitt if he could repair the lock. McQuina left the ship in a state of silent fury. 3 days later, on the morning of March 22nd, McQuina and his sub-chiefs returned to the Boston and dined with Captain Salter and his officers, regaling the sailors with the Nootka war dance. At the chief's suggestion, the first mate and 9 crew members went ashore after breakfast to fish for salmon. Shortly after the departure of the boats, Jewitt wrote, I went down to my vice bench in the steerage, where I was employed in cleaning muskets. I had not been there more than an hour when I heard the men hoisting in the longboat, which in a few minutes after was succeeded by a great bustle and confusion on deck. I immediately ran up the steerage stairs, but scarcely was my head above deck when I was caught by the hair by one of the savages and lifted from my feet. Fortunately for me, my hair being short and the ribbon with which it was tied slipping, I fell from his hold into the steerage. As I was falling, he struck at me with an axe, which cut a deep gash in my forehead and penetrated the skull. But in consequence of his losing his hold, I luckily escaped the full force of the blow, which otherwise would have cleft my head in two. I fell, stunned and senseless, upon the floor. How long I continued in this situation, I know not, but on recovering my senses, the first thing that I did was to try to get up, but so weak was I from loss of blood that I fainted and fell. I was, however, soon recalled to my recollection by 3 loud shouts or yells from the savages, which convinced me that they had got possession of the ship. It is impossible for me to describe my feelings at this terrific sound. Some faint idea may be formed of them by those who have known what it is to half awaken from a hideous dream and still think it real. Never, no never shall I lose from my mind the impression of that dreadful moment. I expected every instant to share the wretched fate of my unfortunate companions, and when I heard the song of triumph by which these infernal yells was succeeded, my blood ran cold in my veins. Chief McQuina, Jewitt later learned, had seen him fall into the steerage and had ordered his warriors not to kill him, hoping to make use of his blacksmithing skills. Muskets and steel weapons, he knew, would give his warriors an advantage over their southerly rivals, the Clayoquot Nootka under Chief Wickaninish. McQuina brought the wounded blacksmith up on the blood-slick deck and informed him that if he consented to be his slave, he would spare his life. Jewitt accepted his servitude, the first act of which was to identify the severed heads of his sailing companions, which the Nootka had arranged in a line on the quarterdeck for his inspection. Amid the ghastly display were the heads of the sailors who had gone ashore to fish, whom the Nootka had decapitated on shore. John Jewitt spent nearly 3 years as a slave of McQuina, adopting the clothing and lifestyle of the Nootka. He was joined in captivity by the sailmaker John Thompson, who had escaped the initial massacre, and who was spared execution when Jewitt begged for his life, telling the chief that he was his father. After about 11 months in Nootka Sound, Jewitt and Thompson bore witness to an unaccountable ailment, which took hold of Tatoosh, McQuina's brother-in-law and foremost sub-chief, and a champion among the Moachat warriors. Tatoosh had led the attack on the sailors who had gone ashore to fish, and had brought their severed heads to the Boston for identification, throwing their bodies into the sea. During this foray, the sub-chief personally slew 2 Americans named Hall and Wood. In February 1804, Tatoosh began to suffer from what Jewitt interpreted as vivid hallucinations. While in the enjoyment of highest health, he wrote, he was suddenly seized with a fit of delirium, in which he fancied that he saw the ghosts of Hall and Wood, constantly standing beside him and threatening him so that he would take no food, except that was forced into his mouth. A short time before this, he had lost a daughter of about 15 years of age, which afflicted him greatly. And whether his insanity, a disorder very uncommon among these savages, no instance of the kind having occurred within the memory of the oldest man among them, proceeded from this cause, or that, for hidden purposes, the supreme disposer of events sometimes permits the spirits of the dead to revisit the world and haunt the murderer, I know not. But his mind from this period, until his death, which took place but a few weeks after that of his son, was incessantly occupied with the images of the men whom he had killed. When McQuina was first informed by his sister of the strange conduct of her husband, Jewitt continued, he immediately went to his house, taking us with him, suspecting that his disease had been caused by us, and that the ghosts of our countrymen had been called thither by us to torment him. We found him raving about Hall and Wood, saying that they were peshak, that is, bad. McQuina then placed some provisions before him to see if he would eat. On perceiving it, he put forth his hand to take some, but instantly withdrew it with signs of horror, saying that Hall and Wood were there, and would not let him eat. Baffled, McQuina asked Jewitt if he had any idea as to the cause of his brother-in-law's malady. Jewitt proposed that Tatoosh had injured his brain, and suggested that he might be cured by binding, flogging, and confinement, which treatments he believed were administered in the insane asylums of Old England. McQuina decided to try this approach, and tasked the muscular John Thompson, a man of fiery disposition, who hated his captors with a vengeful passion, with the whipping. Thompson was the person selected to administer this remedy, Jewitt wrote, which he undertook very readily, and for that purpose provided himself with a good number of spruce branches, with which he whipped him most severely, laying it on with the best will imaginable, while Tatoosh displayed the greatest rage, kicking, spitting, and attempting to bite all who came near him. This was too much for McQuina, who at length, unable to endure it longer, ordered Thompson to desist, and Tatoosh to be carried back, saying that if there was no other way of curing him but by whipping, he must remain mad. Following the flogging, Tatoosh descended further into derangement, often lashing out at his slaves in fits of fury. Terrified of these outbursts, the warrior's wife eventually took up residence in McQuina's house, bringing their surviving son with her out of harm's way. After 4 months of mental anguish, Tatouche died and was buried with all the honors befitting his status. Tatouche's strange affliction, apparently unprecedented in Nootka Sound, is rendered especially bizarre by the fact that, according to Jewitt, the Moachat Nootka of the early 19th century had no concept of ghosts. "They have no belief in a state of future existence," Jewitt wrote, "as I discovered in conversation with McQuina at Tatouche's death, on my attempting to convince him that he still existed, and that he would again see him after his death. But he could comprehend nothing of it, and pointing to the ground, said that there was the end of him, and that he was like that. Nor do they believe in ghosts, notwithstanding the case of Tatouche would appear to contradict this assertion. But that was a remarkable instance, and such a one as had never been known to occur before." Discounting the possibilities that Nootka's supernatural beliefs varied from band to band, that the Nootka learned the concept of ghosts from whites, or that Tatouche's misadventure was the first incident in a long train of similar experiences, Jewitt's statement is challenged by a passage in the 1868 book, Scenes and Studies of Savage Life, written by Vancouver Island politician and entrepreneur Gilbert Malcolm Sproat. This passage implies that ghost sightings, far from being extraordinary anomalies, were relatively common occurrences on the west coast of Vancouver Island in the mid-1800s, which played a prominent role in Nootka life. Owing to the quantity of indigestible food eaten by the natives, Sproat wrote, referring to the Nootka of Port Alberni, they often dream that they are visited by ghosts. After a supper of blubber, followed by one of the long talks about departed friends which take place round the fire, some nervous and timid person may fancy in the nighttime that he sees a ghost. Sproat proceeded to describe an elaborate ritual to which Nootka ghost seers were sometimes subjected. A child will dream that his deceased parent is standing at one end of the house, he wrote. Waking up with a scream, the dreamer starts from his couch and rends his blanket. Friends hurry round, rake up the fire, and old women begin to sing. The dreamer snatches feathers from his pillow and eats them, and covers his head with them. His nearest relative approaches with a knife and scores the ghost seer's arms and legs till the blood comes, which is received into a dish and sprinkled on his face, and on the part of the house where the spirits seem to be. After the operation, the wounds are dressed with blackberry leaves. If the vision continues, the friends throw articles belonging to the dreamer on the fire and cry, "More, more," till all his property, including clothes, mats, and even his boxes, is heaped upon the fire. The greatest excitement prevails, and young girls are often sick and exhausted for many days after such an unfortunate dream. Maybe Tatouche's madness can simply be attributed to indigestion, perhaps being a case of ichthyoalienotoxism, or hallucinogenic fish poisoning. Maybe, as John Jewitt suggested, the warrior's delirium was the result of a traumatic brain injury. Or perhaps the subchief, like Shakespeare's Macbeth, was truly visited by the vengeful ghosts of the men he slew in cold blood, returned to Earth to torment him for his crime. If you like Canadian ghost stories, then you might want to check out my new video on the historic hauntings of Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, Canada's most haunted town. Although this piece seems to have fallen through the YouTube cracks, I am very pleased with how it turned out, and consider it one of my best videos. It contains first-hand ghost stories that have never been published before, a good historical background on the War of 1812, and little-known security camera footage of what appears to be the ghost of a famous British soldier, not to mention new animations, on-site footage, and custom music throughout. If you'd like to watch this video, please click the end screen card or the link in the description.